Week 12 is officially underway. You guys would have saw both the Thanksgiving and Black Friday action. But today I'll be going through my wide receiver rankings in the tier list format like I give you guys every single week, highlighting my locked-in wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We are on the road to 40,000 subscribers. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. But with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, before I get into the official top 30 list, we have to go through the will they play tier. And the general rule of thumb of guys in this tier is I'd like to see at least one full practice prior to Sunday's game. And if they do not practice, I would lean towards a slightly lower ranked counterpart. You don't want to deal with some of those injury issues. So on the docket for this week, the will they play tier consists of Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, and Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. Starting off with Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, we're really unsure at this point whether or not he will be suiting up on Sunday. And he's been described by fantasy doctors as a guy that will probably hold out from playing this week, hold out from playing until after the Vikings Week 13 bye week. And if you don't have any other Vikings or Bears in this matchup, I will proceed as if I'm without Justin Jefferson. However, if you have guys like Jordan Addison, Khalil Herbert, DJ Moore on your team, along with Justin Jefferson, if he does get the full clearance, if he is full ready to go on Monday Night Football, I would have no problem putting in my lineup. So assuming he doesn't play, but if he does play, he would be back to being a top 15 option in my wide receiver rankings. But we move on to T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals, and he was already ruled out this week. If you guys didn't already hear the information, this is what I'm here to bring you guys. Already ruled out with that hamstring injury, will not be back until next week at the earliest. So if you have T. Higgins, make sure you have your replacement option in. Set those lineups. Marquise Brown, wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals, and this guy seems like a true questionable at this current point. Heel injury he sustained on Wednesday's practice. We really don't know exactly what his status is coming into this Sunday's game, and if he doesn't practice on Saturday, I would be prepared to be without him, but if he does play, he is a top 30 option in my wide receiver rankings. But now we go on to the official top 30 list. Starting off with my wide receivers 1 to 6, and the guys we are going to highlight this week are going to be A.J. Brown, my wide receiver 2 of the Philadelphia Eagles, and Stephon Diggs, my wide receiver 4 of the Buffalo Bills, obviously playing in that big time matchup, 4:25 kickoff, Buffalo at Philadelphia this week. And these guys are absolute studs. So starting off with A.J. Brown, he has been absolutely dominant this season. He's putting up over 20 PPR points per game, en route to a wide receiver 5 point per game pace to start the season. He's been excellent, and he's really shut down the narrative that the Eagles are a 1A, 1B situation, because straight up this year, he has absolutely alpha Devontae Smith, higher targets per route run, target percentage, A-dot, air yards, end zone targets, third and fourth down targets, as well as being the higher scoring player in terms of points per game. He is a stud, locked-in wide receiver 1 every single week, hence him being my wide receiver 2 on the slate. I understand if you had him last week, he had kind of a down performance, but I do think this is a huge bounce back, get right type of spot here. Game environment is absolutely phenomenal in this game. 48.5 implied over-under, which is the highest of the entire slate. I expect all of the pass catchers in this game to eat. And that also applies to Stephon Diggs on the other side. If you do have Stephon Diggs, you do know that he's coming off of 2 back-to-back pedestrian performances. However, they also come after 5 top 10 finishes and 3 top 20 finishes in his other games. These last 2 weeks are 2 of only 3 games where he has failed to be a wide receiver 2 or better in fantasy. However, like I mentioned with A.J. Brown thinking it's a get-right spot, I also do think it is a get-right spot for Stephon Diggs. The Eagles represent a top 5 matchup against wide receivers on the entire matchup chart. And like I said, the Bills are implied for a ton of points this week, aka being a nice eruption spot for Stephon Diggs. Wide receiver 6 for me on the slate is going to be Keenan Allen of the LA Chargers, and he's in an extremely tough matchup on the surface. There's no doubt about it. The Ravens are no joke. They're one of the 5 best teams at limiting opposing wide receivers, but Keenan Allen has been absolutely on fire in his last 3 games. Obviously, we know the context of the situation with the Chargers. They lost Mike Williams for the year. They've lost Josh Palmer for recent weeks, and we've really seen them rely upon Keenan Allen. Not a lot of trust there with the other wide receivers, with Quentin Johnson and the other bodies in that core. So Justin Herbert is leaning on his true cut number 1 wide receiver. I mean, with Keenan Allen, he's commanded 32% of the seasonal targets and 40% of the Chargers' air yards this year. Like I said, this is a tough matchup, but when you are this involved in your team's offense, you're basically matchup proof, like Keenan Allen has proven time in and time out this year. But the other wide receivers who already played that would be ranked in this range, my top 6 wide receivers, my wide receiver 1 on the slate was CeeDee Lamb, obviously played Thanksgiving against the Washington Commanders, turned in 9 targets for a 4 for 53 and 1 touchdown stat line. If you guys had him in your lineup in PPR leagues, he would have scored 17.3 PPR points. Not, the highest ceiling that you would have expected coming into that game environment against the Washington secondary that has struggled. However, I do think if you have CeeDee Lamb in your lineup, you will take 17.3 points. Same thing with Amon St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions, played against Green Bay Packers. He was able to turn in 11 targets, 9 receptions, 95 receiving yards, aka 18.5 PPR points in your lineup. A really strong showing for Amon-Ra in this game. And then finally, Tyreek Hill would have been my wide receiver 5 on the slate. Tough matchup on the surface level, going on the road to play the New York Jets. However, he was able to have a very productive day in terms of fantasy football. 9 catches, 102 yards, and a receiving touchdown on his 12 targets, and turned in 25.4 PPR points. What I've come to learn is that Tyreek Hill is absolutely matchup proof, and he should be ranked as a top 2 wide receiver each and every week. If you have Tyreek Hill, he is the league winner at wide receiver this year. But now we move on to the wide receivers 7 to 12, starting off with Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going to play the Indianapolis Colts on the road this week. And with Mike Evans, he has been absolutely dominant this past season. 25% seasonal target share for Big Mike, and he's pacing for his best season in fantasy football since 2019. He's been extremely good all year, and now he gets a Colts secondary who is a very favorable matchup against opposing wide receivers. In a game where sharps are hammering the over at a 99% clip in this game at that 44 set over-under, he's commanded double-digit targets in 5 games this year, including his last 2 contests, and flat out, I just think he deserves to be treated like a top 12 guy at this point, and given the favorable matchup, I do think he cracks as a top 7 wide receiver on the slate. Wide receiver 9 is Puka Nacua, wide receiver of the LA Rams, going on the road to play the Arizona Cardinals this week. And he's been incredible all season and now gets a prime matchup where the Rams are implied for nearly 23 points. With Matthew Stafford back in the fold, he really struggled in that first matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, one of his worst fantasy performances of the year. But he's been largely predictable for the most part this year. Like when Stafford is healthy, he's commanded nearly 11 targets per game in those contests and about 19 PPR points per game on the season with Stafford in the lineup. Cooper Kupp, like I mentioned, is banged up, is dealing with that ankle injury. Same ankle that he actually got tightrope surgery on this offseason. I'm a little bit wary on him. You guys will see that later in the video, but I'm a little bit wary on Cooper Kupp. Don't really want to trust a 30-year-old wide receiver dealing with that type of injury, hence why I have Puka Nacua raised in the rankings. If we do see Cooper Kupp look like himself, he will be ranked above Puka Nacua, but given the context of the injury, I do prefer Puka this week. Wide receiver 11 for me is Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers at home this week, and flat out, I just don't know where to put this guy. From a talent perspective, he would be an every week tier 1 wide receiver, top 5 wide receiver in my rankings, but I do think that the absence of Joe Burrow cannot be overstated when it comes to Jamar Chase. The books are low on the Cincinnati Bengals. They have less than 17 implied points this week, and while I think Chase is a good enough player to, create a big play, score after the catch, he could be entering the Garrett Wilson range if the quarterback play is not steady in Cincinnati. And another wide receiver that already played that cracked my top 12 would actually be Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. He cracked in as my wide receiver 8. Obviously played that big game Thanksgiving night against the Seattle Seahawks. 13 PPR points, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 50 yards, and a receiving touchdowns. Wasn't a complete lineup killer, but if you do have him as your wide receiver 2, you're probably left a little bit disappointed at that game. But you guys need to start these guys, so now I'll be spending more time breaking down my wide receivers 13 to 30 on the week. Starting off with my wide receiver 13 and the first one of the high-end wide receiver 2s tier, we got Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles going to play the Buffalo Bills, like I mentioned at the top, 4:25 p.m. kickoff this week. And I mentioned with A.J. Brown that he's really truly separated from Devontae Smith this year, but that's not to take away from Devontae Smith. He's performed like a true wide receiver 1 when Dallas Goedert has been inactive in these last 2 seasons. Now we know with Devontae Smith, he gets access to that same prime game environment that A.J. Brown is able to thrive in this week. I think it's going to be a shootout. I think both the Bills and the Eagles will be able to put up points in this game, and I do expect Devontae Smith to be treated like the top 15 wide receiver he is moving forward. Again, like I said, wide receiver 13 for me on the slate, and I think you need to be treating him like a top 15 wide receiver each and every week with Dallas Goedert out of the lineup. Wide receiver 14 for me is actually going to be Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts, going to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at home this week. He's been an alpha target commander all season and now gets a pass funnel Bucs defense. They are the second toughest matchup against opposing running backs, but also a top 10 matchup against opposing wide receivers this year. Vegas has the Colts implied for over 23 points this week, and like I mentioned with Mike Evans, the Sharps are absolutely hammering the over in this game. I expect if the Colts are going to be able to put up points like Vegas suggests, they will get there with the passing game this week. Adam Thielen, wide receiver of the Carolina Panthers, goes to play the Tennessee Titans on the road and comes in as my wide receiver 15 this week. And he gets the most favorable matchup on the entire matchup chart going up against the Tennessee Titans defense. Like I said with Tampa Bay, the Tennessee Titans are an absolute pass funnel of a defense for a wide receiver with Adam Thielen that has earned 10 plus targets in all but 2 games this year. Thielen's currently commanding a 29% target share and has scored as a top 10 wide receiver in PPR this season. If you have Adam Thielen, you get that steady floor with the targets. I am a little bit concerned about his potential spike week ceiling given the nature of this offense and what they're implied for this week. However, Adam Thielen, steady as they come, double-digit targets should be in store yet again. Wide receiver 16 for me is Tank Dell of the Houston Texans, going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars at home this week. And Tank Dell has been absolutely phenomenal in his last few games. He's commanded 10 plus targets in that stretch. And you guys can see his comparison to Nico Collins since coming back from that injury. He has been the true number 1 wide receiver for this offense. 28% of the targets, higher ADOT, higher air yards, and higher end zone target percentage, en route to 21 PPR points per game in that stretch. Now, do I think he's going to be a 21 PPR point per game scorer? No. However, seeing this type of rookie explosion and that rapport that he has with CJ Stroud already bodes well for Tank Dell's outlook as a wide receiver 2 rest away. If he keeps stacking performances like he has in these last few weeks, I think you have to consider him a top 15 wide receiver moving forward. For now, he's going to come in as my wide receiver 16 on the slate. Wide receiver 17 for me was actually Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. He did play in that Friday game, Black Friday, against the New York Jets. Had him this low given the matchup implications going up against the Jets, but it really didn't seem like the Miami Dolphins passing offense struggled in this game at all. 8 targets for Jalen Waddle. He turned into 8 receptions, 114 yards, and 19.4 PPR points. If you have Jalen Waddle, you couldn't have asked for much more given the matchup at hand he had this week. Wide receiver 18 for me is Cooper Kupp of the LA Rams, going on the road to play the Arizona Cardinals. And he typically would be in the will they play section, but he was actually cleared ahead of time today on Friday. Sean McVay already gave the go-ahead that Cooper Kupp will be ready to go in this game. And he normally would be much higher on this list, but I have built in a little bit of doubt here. Is he on a pitch count? Is he going to be limited at all? Obviously, like I mentioned with Puka Nacua, an older wide receiver dealing with that same ankle injury that he suffered in the offseason and actually got surgery on. So I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm a little bit nervous. If you have Cooper Kupp, kind of demote your own expectations for him, knowing that he could be on a pitch count. However, if he does get that full allotment of snaps and does look healthy in this game, I expect him to produce at a top 6 to 8 level this week. But now we move on to the low-end wide receiver 2s of the rankings, and we actually go to my start of the week as my wide receiver 19, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, going to play the LA Chargers on the road. And Zay Flowers is poised to absolutely run the rest of the way, with the news that Mark Andrews did get hurt and is expected to miss the rest of the season with the injury he suffered in last week's game. I think Zay Flowers is ready to take flight. The Ravens have been surprisingly a pass-heavy team in the last month of the season, and while you can make the argument that with Mark Andrews out, maybe they lean on the run more, I do think this is a testament to both the abilities of Lamar Jackson and the abilities of the wide receiver core that we've seen. Obviously, Odell Beckham has been playing pretty well in his own right, but I do think the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on this team is Zay Flowers. He has the 3rd easiest matchup on the entire matchup chart against a struggling Chargers secondary. And in the one game we saw him in with Mark Andrews out of the lineup, we did see him command 10 targets in his first career game. Like I mentioned with the Chargers, very easy matchup, 25.5 implied points for the Ravens offense this week. I think he is in an absolute smash spot. And if you have Zay Flowers, like I said, I expect him to contend for top 18 wide receiver status moving forward if he can stockpile some performances. Wide receiver 20 for me is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, on the road to play the Houston Texans this week. And I mentioned it with Tank Dell, but Christian Kirk is on the other side. He had a down game this past week against the Titans, but he's garnered a 23% seasonal target share on this Jaguars offense. The Jags are implied for 25 points this week, and Trevor Lawrence played much better this last week in what's been a relatively underwhelming year for his own standards. And I wrestle with who to place higher between Christian Kirk or Calvin Ridley on a week-to-week basis, but with the Texans being a favorable matchup to opposing wide receivers, I do think that both of the Jags should eat in this game. Wide receivers 21 and 22 for me respectively were Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers and DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Thursday Night Football kickoff, night game in Seattle for Thanksgiving this week. We were able to see Deebo Samuel have a monster game. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 15 rushing yards with a rushing touchdown, en route to 22.4 PPR points. On the flip side with DK Metcalf, a very underwhelming performance for his own standards. 9 targets, he was only able to convert into 3 receptions and 32 receiving yards. So Deebo Samuel, obviously, if you had him in your lineup, big smash spot this week. You're off to a great start if you did have Deebo, given the expectation you could have had and given the results you ended up getting with over 22 points. With DK Metcalf, however, 6.2 PPR points, Come on, man. You're able to command 9 targets, but you're not able to produce on them. We're going to need to see better days from DK Metcalf for him to earn this spot in the rankings moving forward. Till then, man, until we see more signs from DK and this passing offense of the Seahawks, I think he's more of a fringe top 30 option than the wide receiver 2 people drafted him as. Wide receivers 23 and 24 for me, respectively, are DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears and Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. That big-time Monday Night Football matchup, we got the Minnesota Vikings hosting the Chicago Bears. Starting off with DJ Moore, and it really feels gross given the fact that they have a low implied total this week, and the Vikings have been a very tough matchup against opposing wide receivers as of late, but Moore has been an absolute different beast with Justin Fields at the quarterback position. He has been by far the most conducive quarterback for the fantasy success of DJ Moore throughout his career, and I think they continue building on the rapport that we saw throughout the season. In 7 games, he's averaging over 20 PPR points per game and nearly 100 receiving yards per game in that stretch. Moore's commanded an impressive 28% target share on the season, and like I said, I do think he's going to be the main source of offense for the struggling Bears unit. And on the flip side, Jordan Addison is coming off 3 straight disappointing performances. I'm starting to get a little bit worried with the upside he has with Josh Dobbs at the quarterback position and full defensive attention with Justin Jefferson presumably out of the lineup, but the Bears are awful against the pass, and the Vikings are implied for over 23 points this week. And with Jordan Addison, it basically just comes down to Josh Dobbs. If Josh Dobbs plays well, I do think this is a really nice bounce back spot given the matchup for him against Chicago. If Josh Dobbs does not play well, then I do have my concerns about Jordan Addison. But now we can move on to the wide receiver 3s in this list, starting off with my wide receivers 25 and 26 respectively. Nico Collins of the Houston Texans and Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Already mentioned 2 of their teammates with Christian Kirk and Tank Dell, but these are the 2, big play outside threats of their respective offenses. And if the game does go the route of a shootout, which is what I expect this week, I think each of these wide receivers represents a very strong ceiling. Despite their lesser involvement on a week-to-week basis compared to their teammates, we have seen the spike spots, especially for Ridley, but also for Nico Collins earlier in the season. So I do think, like I said, both sides are going to be airing it out. And while I do prefer the teammates based off their target percentages, I do think that these big play threats could also have a big field day this week. Wide receiver 27 for me is Garrett Wilson, wide receiver of the New York Jets. And he was able to turn 10 targets into 7 receptions, 44 yards, and a receiving touchdown in this contest. 17.4 PPR points. And all that reminds me, man, is if this guy had Aaron Rodgers, he would have been an elite top 5 wide receiver this year. He's still making his hay with poor quarterback play, but man, I just want to see this guy with a quarterback moving forward. Hopefully Aaron Rodgers is healthy to start 2024. Wide receiver 28 for me was Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Very pedestrian game on Thursday Night Football. 5 targets, 3 receptions for 30 yards, and only 6 PPR points against the San Francisco 49ers. This Seattle passing attack looks like a mess right now. Obviously, Geno Smith suffering with that triceps injury he suffered in last week's game, and it looks like it's going to be a concern, man. Geno didn't really look like he was on the ball. The wide receiver core really struggled as a whole, and I'm going to have to dock these Seattle wide receivers moving forward because each of them has disappointed. Wide receiver 29 for me is Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, going to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at home this week, and Josh Downs was ascending to wide receiver 2 territory prior to getting hurt, and in games where he's played over 80% of the snaps this year, he's put up a 23% target share and over 14 PPR points per game in that stretch. It's an easy matchup against a pass funnel Bucs defense, and I expect the Colts to lean on their passing attack in this game. It's a smash spot, and I do think it's a chance for Downs to prove that he should be higher on this list moving forward. Wide receiver 30 for me is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, going to play the New Orleans Saints at home this week, and it's been a disappointing month for Drake London, but we really saw him turning the page prior to that injury he suffered in week 9. And weeks 4 to 8, this guy was an absolute target monster. 26% target share, 67% of the share of the end zone targets, and 14.2 PPR points per game in that stretch. He had his bye week. It looks like he's going to be fully recovered from that knee injury he suffered. And although it's a tough matchup on surface level, Drake London commands targets on this offense. And when he's healthy, in my opinion, he is a wide receiver too. So baking in some of the risk level given the matchup and because he hasn't played up to that par. But I do expect if Drake London gets his full allotment of snaps, him to be a top 30 option this week and potentially move up moving forward. But now we go on to my 5 favorite deep flex league plays, starting off with the Bills wide receivers, Gabe Davis and Khalil Shakir, going on the road to play the Philadelphia Eagles. And I've really mentioned this game environment in today's video, but I'm comfortable starting every single piece of this game. Shakir has been the hot name, big time touchdown last week against the New York Jets, but I also do think this is a prime bounce back for Gabe Davis after that goose egg he had against New York last week. And I do think that both of these guys are top 45 options this week. Massive ceilings tethered to the right arm of Josh Allen, who's going to be on a tear moving forward with the Bills needing to rack wins. Tyler Boyd at the Cincinnati Bengals goes to play the Pittsburgh Steelers, and with T. Higgins out of the lineup, Tyler Boyd has commanded 18 targets in his last 2 games, and while the quarterback play is a major question mark with Jake Browning getting the start, I expect Tyler Boyd to be peppered in this game as the main slot wide receiver. Third wide receiver I want to talk about is Elijah Moore of the Cleveland Browns going to play the Denver Broncos on the road this week, and it's a tough matchup with DTR going up against a Denver defense that has really turned it around as of recent weeks. However, 7 targets and double-digit PPR points for Moore in his last 2 games, and I think he is a solid wide receiver 4 option given the volume he has seen in recent weeks. Rashid Shaheed, wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints, goes to play the Atlanta Falcons on the road, and Michael Thomas was placed on IR this week, and the last time we saw Rashid Shaheed on the field, he was peppered with 9 targets, and I expect Olave to be that clear-cut wide receiver 1, that alpha wide receiver 1 for this team, but I do think there's more than enough volume for Rashid Shaheed to also eat on this offense, and he's been a top 45 wide receiver on the year with MT healthy. Now I do think he has an opportunity to rise even higher with increased targets moving forward. Fifth option at wide receiver is going to be Greg Dortch, wide receiver of the Arizona Cardinals, going to play the LA Rams at home this week. He got 8 targets and 13.6 PPR points last week with Michael Wilson out of the lineup. Michael Wilson was already rolled out again, and of course, like I mentioned at the top of the video, Marquise Brown is questionable with that heel injury. We know Wilson's out, but especially if Marquise Brown misses, I expect Greg Dortch to be a volume play on an offense I expect to be good moving forward with Kyler Murray at the helm. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, like I said, make sure you leave a like down below and comment your biggest start-sit decision. I will try to get to as many as possible. With that being said, peace out. Good luck in your matchups. Let's secure those playoff spots.